It says that she is a gaunt, black-haired glamour ghoul who comes out through ominous...
You're still afraid.
Stop it now, I mean it.
You know how people exaggerate.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Goes this with...
Stop it! You're
Barbara?
Get off this thing!
Come on, it's time for the Ghost of Hollywood.
Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of the Ghost of Hollywood. I'm Poxy Leonard here with Miss Ragan, and tonight it's all about Technicolor, baby.
Oh, here we go. You read one book on Technicolor and now you're a pro, yeah?
Yes, of course. I mean, that's all it takes is one book, and I've got it figured out. I'm sorry to tell you.
Yeah, I hear you, Poxy.
Whatever.
Anyway, I'm Miss Ragan, and tonight you're in for an extremely interesting episode of The Ghost of Hollywood, as we discuss the 1989 sci-fi cult film, Space Avenger, with the director, Richard W. Haines. While Richard is typically associated with his earlier work on Splatter University and classic Nuke Em High, Space Avenger would become one of the most essential films in his catalog. I say this not only because Space Avenger is a well-executed B-film, but Richard's use of dye transfer process in developing the film during post-production would result in his 1993 book called Technicolor Movies, The History of Dye Transfer Printing.
In the book, Richard explores the evolutionary history of the dye transfer process and the company Technicolor, who many of you may know nothing more about aside from their brand name on an older movie poster. And not to condescend, because even though now I'm a master
You
of
don't
this
even know
art,
how to
I'm
load
trying
film
to
into
tell
a camera,
you just
Poxy.
I can dream.
Probably the best it'll get for you.
Yeah. Thanks, Reagan. Anyway,
No problem.
yeah. For those of you who are listening and are knowledgeable on the subject of dye transfer printing and lots of color,
Yes.
hopefully
So many colors.
Yeah, hopefully I'm able. I know you can. No, hopefully we're actually able to do this topic a little bit of justice for you.
Don't worry, old man. I'm here in case you mess anything up.
Always good to have you around, Reagan. Speaking of which, I know you just celebrated your 37th birthday, so I brought you a present.
I'm not opening that.
Why not?
It looks dangerous.
It kind of is dangerous, but if you don't want it, I can give it to someone else.
Sure, whatever makes you feel better.
You accepting this present would make me feel better.
Yeah, okay. So, you're listening to The Ghost of Hollywood. I'm Miss Ragan here with Poxy Leonard, and we'll be back with you shortly to discuss the 1989 sci-fi Technicolor film, Space Avenger, with director Richard W. Haines. Poxy and myself, along with the rest of the crew here at GOH, also read Richard's 1993 book entitled Technicolor Movies, The History of Dye Transfer Printing, where he details the history of Technicolor and explains the technical aspects of how dye transfer process was used and evolved during the 20th century.
More on that later. This is Witch Fiend with Give 'Em Hell. And you are listening to The Ghosts of Hollywood. We'll be back with you shortly. Stay tuned.
Well, you better believe it's true. Want us you to come again.
with Give 'em Hell, right here on the Ghost of Hollywood. I'm Poxy Leonard with Miss Ragan, and the time has come for another segment of the Capsule Review.
Tonight, we're going to sit down with our tour filmmaker and author, Richard W. Haines, to talk about his 1989 sci-fi Technicolor film, Space Avenger.
And just in case you get lost or confused in your research, the film is known sometimes as Alien Space Avenger, so make sure to note that. Now, Reagan and I also read Richard's 1993 book, Technicolor Movies, The History of Dye Transfer Printing. And although the book totals just short of 150 pages, it's pretty thorough in its explanation of the evolution and then eventual decline of dye transfer printing and the Technicolor company.
The book features several diagrams explaining the working parts of each Technicolor process and gives a great deal of insight into the introduction of sound in movies and the various approaches taken by different companies towards improving or, in some cases, hindering the cinematographic process.
I'll admit, it changed my perspective entirely on the way that early films were made. I also found that the sections like the one discussing Disney's transition to the color process with the film Flowers and Trees relatively intriguing to learn about as well.
Quick explanation for everyone out there. Despite his brother Roy's disapproval, remember, they were business partners. Walt Disney actually accepted an offer from Technicolor founder Herbert Kalmus to produce Flowers and Trees using what was known as a successive exposure method. This relationship between Disney and Technicolor actually lasted until the Hollywood Technicolor plant closed in 1975.
You know, in the book, Richard also goes to great lengths to explain the merge towards an inferior color process known as Eastman color. The essential argument for the superiority of the Technicolor process is simple. So, simple enough actually, in fact, to describe in a single word. Fade. And the issue of deteriorating color materials would eventually bring enough public attention to the quality of Kodak stock, which would result in pressure on the company to develop a better product, and they did, low-fade film.
The impact that Technicolor had on cinema was huge, and this can be seen even today in movies such as North by Northwest, The Searchers, or Around the World in 80 Days, just to name a few. The colors are surreal, with an exploitative beauty.
Of course, there's a lot more ground covered in the book on topics such as the birth of the television medium, anamorphic lenses, optical sounds, cinerama, changing industry, all kinds of stuff. But what's interesting, though, is Haines' application of this knowledge when working on his feature, Space Avenger, because during the time that he made it, the only film lab left in the world where dye transfer printing was available was located in Beijing, China, where Richard would travel to produce it in 1989. Now, Space Avenger stars Robert Pritchard, Charity Staley, Mike McCleary, and Gina Mastrogiacomo during the early days of their careers, and centers around 4 aliens who crashed their ship on Earth in the year of all years, 1939. And from there, they go on to snatch the bodies of 4 people and live their lives out forth it.
Fast forward to 1989, and they're on their way to New York to kill their creator, a comic book artist named Matt Brandt. Now, Haines' motto is that life imitates art, which is reflected clearly by the contrasting colors created using the dye transfer process. There are also a lot of uniquely designed special effects, such as the headless lady in the red dress running about the halls, the outer space sequences with the spaceship, regenerating limbs, and all sorts of other wild effects that were developed for Alien Space Avenger.
So, you ready to do this or what?
I believe it is time, Poxy.
We have arrived. We have made it. Cool. All right, let's go then. You ready? Stay tuned, because when we return, director Richard W. Haines will join us on the show to talk about his work on Space Avenger and the book, Technicolor Movies, The History of Dye Transfer Printing.
This is Binary Star with Reality Check. You're listening to The Ghost of Hollywood.
When you hear this, that is the introduction.
This is how I represent. I rock the mic 110%. It's intimate. I keep the party moving like an immigrant. Binary star, superstar, it's no coincidence. Every verse is intricate. This ain't a circus in a tent. We don't get down like them clowns in the Kents. I'm used to being indigent. Who said it's all about the Benjamins? I want a fortune. I want to make music. my soul is my philosophy. High velocity, lyrics like Nostradamus making prophecy. I told you cats a long time ago, it ain't no stopping me. I bomb your set, that's not a threat, it's a promise. Got everybody riding on my wagon like the Amish. But still I never claim to be a big rap star, cause no matter who you are, it's still Allah who act bar. Better believe this, most rappers can't achieve this. I'm bad to the bone, but x-rays can't even see this. See, I'm strategic, I let your money talk bullshit. Walk while I keep it rolling like paraplegics. Whoever's on the microphone, let it be known, you in danger. I got next like the Boston Strangler. You ain't never heard an MC speak like this. And Rodney King ain't never felt the beat like this.
That is the main theme. I'm gonna do something else.
Get a grip on yourself, cause you ain't gripping minds. Life and times idolized, rap guys out of line, careers I finalize. Collide with this serenade cyanide you've applied for silicide. The thing that makes killers hide, hang them high by they gold link necktie, and drain them dry into temper style. Now you ain't Kai, so you ain't that high. Wanna be aeronautic, then get swatted for acting fly. Masterminds, crafty rhymes, ill went from drafty lines. They chill spines like the Alpines, running up on Sanam turbines, a close encounter of the worst kind. Go ask some cats that heard I'm lyrical turpentine. Who wanna taste mine? I carry hell on the waistline. God's gift the baseline, so let the phlegm fly. I surmise 7-5 through the MI. When I forcefully Jedi in the bull's eye, red eye, heads fly, bed eye, sharp shoot, dead eye, snooze, cruise, bed by. Mary Lou flipping eye, paper punk, ripping eye, stomping eye, simplify, represent, temper eye, signify, walking rhyme, make nothing similar. Or Gemini, or in this perimeter, Gemini, cats be cut dry. I'm a wild wet guy. I be raining precipitation till it's 1 inch from neck high. Rest fly kids, mid sky, without an alibi. Who said you rap tight? You come and rap by a slice of this rap. Scalpel guys, quick as apple pie. I'm learned in all schools of thought and shit you baffle by. Conceptual, intellectual, fox slide. Silla oxide, rhymes flow like a rock slide. You must have forgot I slap your ass, knock, needed, cockeyed, bruised, battered, broken up, open cut, dipped in peroxide. Death to the pot fly.
Usually I don't do request numbers, unless, of course, I have been asked to do so.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt your regularly scheduled program to give you this news update. Alien terrorists are invading the city, spreading chaos. They are mating with human beings.
You make me so hot.
They have assaulted a nuclear power plant.
You guys got your security passes? I hate red tape.
Only one man can stop them. Space Avenger, a film by Richard W. Haines.
Well, hello, wall crawlers. I'm Poxy Leonard, and you're listening to The Ghost of Hollywood. Before the break, Reagan and I were discussing the book, Technicolor Movies, by Richard W. Haines, and how his work on that subject would ultimately culminate in his 1989 sci-fi cult classic, Space Avenger. How are you this evening, Richard?
I'm doing good.
Thank you for coming on the show. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us tonight.
Clear this up for me. I read Space Avenger made its debut in 1989 at the Toronto International Film Festival, but it didn't see a video premiere in the U.S. until 1990 and began seeing distribution in 1992. When would you consider the official release date to be?
Well, the way we distributed it is along the lines of what Tom Lawland did with Billy Jack. He kind of created a formula here that I adopted and many other indies adopted, which is we didn't do a national release, we did a regional release, a city at a time, a territory at a time with heavy promotion and publicity, and we just made the rounds around the country. Even when it was on video, we were still doing the rounds because it had the gimmick of having a Technicolor print, and so we could continue to book it even if it was on video already. Now, if you want to get technical, the actual premiere of the film was at the Paramount Center of the Arts, where we shot there in July of 1988. Then it was shown at the American Film Market. Walter Manley was our sales rep for 1989 in March, and we started making international sales, and then it went to the Toronto Film Festival in September. This again is 1989, then the American Film Institute in October, Virginia Festival in November, the B Film Festival in Canada in January 1990, the Fantastique Festival in Brussels 1990, and then we played it theatrically in Los Angeles in 1990, and all the way up through 1992 we were booking it around the country, and it played the Chicago's Music Box Movie Palace in August of 1992. So we were booking it for, I guess, a couple of years at least, maybe 2 or 3 years actually, and that's the way I do these movies. We did the same thing with my other films like Run for Cover in 3D. As long as it has some sort of novelty or gimmick, you can keep on booking it even if it's already on video because it's something different for people to see.
Yeah, so it's almost like it kind of sounds like you're like peddling it, you know, like back in the day, like you kind of go town to town peddling.
Well, yeah, sure. Yeah. It's a hard sell, but decent quality. And again, it was really Corman did it, but I think Lawland did it most successfully when he did Billy Jack, and that became kind of the formula that other people followed. It took him years. Billy Jack is a 1969 movie. He was still booking it, and I guess all the way up to 73, 74. So. Again, heavy promotion on a city-by-city basis. So.
Well, you said it's a hard
release and heavy promotion.
As far as a hard sell, what do you mean? Are you talking about like the content itself?
Well, the trailer, the publicity, interviews, anything you can to help, promote it. And of course, I was doing the Technicolor promotion, and that helped me get in most of the film festivals. And again, it was very prestigious. I booked in 2 movie palaces, the Paramount, which we shot in, and the Chicago Music Box, just because it was in Technicolor. And we also got the American Film Institute to play it. And of course, I donated print there too. So that really helped get the ball running. I got a good review I got a write-up from Robert Osborne in the Hollywood Reporter. So the Technicolor aspect of it really got the film known and got it booked all over the country. So
in previous interviews, you worked with Bob Harris, and I know that you had 10 prints or something of that you said, and one which you'd archived
to film collector circles. A lot of people were film collectors, and he was actually restoring Lawrence of Arabia while we were doing Space Avenger, and I had loaned him something to use as color timing reference to color correct a 65mm negative, but he also helped me raise money in a film and worked on the film as well. So he was doing 2 things at once. He was restoring the film and working on my film.
Nice. All right. So well then let's talk. You described the theme in previous interviews. You described the theme of Space Avenger, and I know you describe a lot of your work as this way too, to be life as art. So with that in mind, how was the screenplay developed? Like I know, with Splatter, you worked with the writing team, right? So who'd you write with this time? Did you write all this on your own? How was this put together?
Yeah, I had a collaborator as well. Actually, all the screenplays are originated by me, and I often bring in other people to help polish them up. In that case, it was Linwood Sawyer for Space Avenger, who later became the publisher of my books, my novels. Now, the actual theme I like to explore is actually life imitates art, which is where an artist or a writer or somebody like that is interacting with his fictional characters. This was the first one I did it on, but I liked the theme enough that I revived it in Unsavory Characters, which is about a pulp fiction writer who goes looking for a femme fatale to help him write his book. He finds one, and he uses those experiences to finish his book. Of course, on Space Avenger was a comic book artist who is interacting with his fictional characters, and What Really Frightens You is about a magazine guy, a fanzine. He writes for horror fanzines, and he asks that title question, What Really Frightens You? And he interacts with his characters who actually experience what frightens them after the interview. So that was sort of the theme I liked. And I also did it in my books, too, which is What Really Frightens You 2, What Really Frightens You 3. Now, in my case, I wasn't planning to become a novel writer, but I later did, so that kind of worked out for me, too. So everything kind of all connected there, the idea of interacting with your fictional characters as if they're real.
You've mentioned this previously as well, that you have a lot of personal interests coming from, like, you mentioned famous monsters and stuff like that.
Most of the stuff that I write about is stuff I experienced. So, yeah, What Really Frightens You was about the fanzines.
Or fanzines, sorry, thank
comics. You. The Castle of Frankenstein, Famous Monsters of Filmlands. I grew up with them because I really love the horror flicks and I like reading about them. And one of the contributors of them was William K. Everson, the film historian, who later was one of my teachers in college, which was kind of fun.
All right.
I also forgot, in terms of Space Avenger, one of my other teachers before he became the Entertainment Tonight guy was Leonard Maltin. So I contacted him after I did the Technicolor Space Avenger, and he put me on a show and interviewed me, so that really helped market it as well. So it seems like everything that happens to me all sort of connects to my movies and books, which is sort of interesting. Also, I was a comic book artist, and I did the actual illustrations for the book Animal Kingdom, which I think was about 2002, yeah. So I'm actually a comic book artist as well, but that was one of the things I wanted to do if it wasn't for film, but I ended up going as the film route because I prefer that.
Well, Animal Kingdom, tell me more about that then, because I was going to ask you about that anyway. That was a collaborative effort with your father, right?
Yeah, my father wrote the text, and I did the comic book illustrations, and we published it through Exibris. So I did finally get one of my comic book things out there. It's kind of a satiric sort of a combination of Dr. Zeus and Mad Magazine, if you want.
All right.
So it's kind of funny and satiric, and I did the comic illustrations for that. Anyway, since I was a comic book fan and I could draw, I thought it would be fun to do a movie about a comic book artist, and what if these characters that he's creating actually exist? And that's where it went from there. But Linwood Sawyer did step in and help me develop the characters and stuff like that. The original screenplays are always my ideas, and then I often bring in collaborators to help me polish it up a bit. So.
Well, how long did you work on the screenplay before you actually went into production?
I'd say about 6 months. I usually work on the screenplay, and then it's at least 3 to 4 months of pre-production, and then it's the shoot. Now, in the case of Space Avenger, this is a really long shoot. What we did to raise money was I used money I made on Splatter University, and I shot the special effects first and the 1930s period sequence. So I shot the regeneration effect. I shot the whole 1930 sequences, and then I used that to raise money to get money for the rest of the film.
Now, you shooting those first, was it to generate interest, or was it because of the financial aspects of it?
Yeah, it was to generate interest and also prove it could be done, and also help market the thing in terms of getting investors, because the special effects were by a guy named John Bisson, and he was assisted by Ralph Cirella, who later ended up working for Howard Stern, and they did the practical effects, latex molds and stuff, and we did the whole regeneration sequence at the end, and it came off great, so that helped us raise money to get the rest. So we shot the 1930s stuff first in 1986, and then the rest in, I believe, 87. Basically all the stuff that takes place after the aliens come out in the 80s was done separately.
Well,
I was lucky the actors stuck by me for the whole thing, so we were lucky.
Yeah, so that, that's what I was saying, working under a tight budget, and with this being stretched out as far as it was, and you consider this stuff like, you always refer to it as B+ film material. So explain, you're already kind of involved in it with me in conversation here, but explain more of the financial approach that you had to take as far as going throughout the duration of this process, working with the actors and getting everybody kind of stay on board with you. There had to be a lot of, synergy going, with this group in order for you to get this done and the constraints that you had surrounding it.
Well, low-budget films, there's a lot of people think, they see a really bad low-budget film and say, well, they didn't have any money to make it good. It really has something to do with it. You can make a great low-budget film. It's just how you allocate the money. And it's mostly just a lot of pre-production and preparation. Most of the low-budget films I worked on really didn't do that, and it looks it. So I storyboarded, I'm an artist, so I storyboarded the entire film so everybody knows what every shot is.
Yeah.
And then we rehearse everything, and then I brought in a really good camera crew, and we figured out how to do all these effects, and we did tests and everything like that. So we do lots and lots of preparation. We do monster tests. We did some test footage to make sure it was going to work and things like that. And then when you're actually shooting, it's all ready to go. It's pretty much already been done. You're just now following through with the actual shoot. I don't shoot much film either. Very little film. Just as long as the take is good, we move on to the next one. Maybe we do a backup take. But the whole thing is rehearsed and everything, so I really plan very, very carefully. That's the only way you can make a B+ film with very, very limited funds. Otherwise, it's going to look cheap and cheesy.
Where does your company, New Wave Distribution, come into play here?
All right, well, my first film, Splatter University, which we made in 16 millimeter, I think I called my company Richard W. Haines Productions.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But then for Space Avenger, I changed the name to New Wave Films, and I added distribution because I was going to market it myself. So I marketed all my films from Space Avenger on, and New Wave, New Age, whatever, it sounded good. Also, it hadn't been used yet. I was surprised that New Wave Film Distribution was a title I researched. It hadn't actually been used, so I thought it would sound good, and that's what I used as my basic company to distribute it. However, the actual production company is a separate company in all cases, because you have to get insurance for that and all that.
Well, I know Space Avenger was shot in and around New York City, but I'm curious to know where the nuclear power plant scenes were filmed.
Okay, that wasn't a power plant. That was actually garbage recycling plant in Peekskill, which looked pretty good, and we just got all those costumes to put people in. And for the exterior, I had a guy called Theo Pignorelli, who also did the similar stuff for class of Nuke Em High, and he created these miniatures. And what I did was what's called in-camera mats, going all the way back to the silent days, like Buster Keaton, and also...
Yeah, explain this.
Mats. You block off part of the lens, shoot the bottom part, and block off the top part and reverse it, rewind the camera, negative, and then expose another part of the frame. And so the top part of the frame were actually miniatures, and the bottom part were live action. And the trick on it, have movement, have people running around and stuff, and you don't really see the join line because it's all done in the camera, and you save money on opticals, and it's not grainy. So we did these in-camera mats for that, and for my other films too. So that's how we did it. So it's actually a garbage recycling plant that we propped up with the top part of the frame as nuclear power plant models.
How long did it take you to be able to... Was there a lot of complication in shooting it that way?
No, what we did is we used Aeroflex, the basic principal photography.
Yeah.
But there was a guy, I think his name was Adam Teichman. He had an old Mitchell camera used in his studio days, which has really, really good rock-steady registration. But it's like a tank. It's huge, so it's not really mobile, so we had that on a tripod, and that's what we used. And so when you rewind a camera and then double expose it, it's going to be rock steady. With an Arri, it's not as steady. You may get a little jiggling between the separate elements. So we used an old Mitchell camera, studio camera, for those specific effects. Where did I learn how to do this? In 1979, I went to the Silent Clowns Festival in New York City at the 8th Street Playhouse, and I was watching all these Buster Keaton films with these really astounding special effects. And I researched it, and he did them all in camera. They didn't actually have duplicating stock on a silent hour. If you wanted to make a fade, you had to fade out the camera. Dissolve, you had to rewind the camera, double exposure. And when Keaton did all these wacky effects where he's jumping inside the movie screen and stuff, that was all done in camera by rewinding the camera and double and triple exposing the effects. They didn't actually have duplicating stock until the 1930s, and so I said, well, maybe I'll try that, and that's how we did it. We did it with the spaceships, too. We had spaceship miniatures and a matte black, which you punch holes in for stars, and the planets were beach balls, and we just double and triple exposed those sequences and saved money on optics.
Wow, you said the planets were actually beach balls?
Beach balls painted, yeah. And then the spaceships look pretty good, and we just dolly past them, basically. The key in doing it in spaceships, you don't move the ships. They're jiggle. You move the camera. So you put the camera on a tripod and on a dolly, and you just dolly past it. And then you later back up the thing and add the stars, and then later add the planets, and that's how we did those. So most of the effects in Space Avenger were in camera mats by just cranking back the camera, double and triple exposing them. But all these things were done with a Mitchell because it had the better image steadiness.
Is it? This process is foreign to me. So is this tedious? It sounds tedious.
Well, of course it is, yeah. But so what?
Well, I'm just asking.
Fun. I like the challenge to be able to pull these things off. And again, how much money do you save by not having to do optical effects? Or a fortune. So we did them all in camera and saved a lot of money.
What about the accessibility to the equipment that you need to do this stuff? Pretty much there?
Yeah. I usually get people that own their own equipment. I rarely rent equipment. I might rent lights, but the actual cameras I usually hire cameramen who have their own cameras, so you know they're going to be in good working order. And when you rent something like that, you don't know if it's going to be good. It could break down and stuff. So if someone owns the camera, then because that's their business, it's going to be in top-notch shape. Usually hire cameramen in their own equipment, and then it's going to be in good shape for the shoot.
How many cinematographers you have working on Alien Space Avenger? How many were on set with there? Do you have a second unit, primary unit?
For the 30 stuff, we used Victor. I forgot his last name. And then for the rest of it, we used because we had a different crew for the other stuff.
Yeah.
They all went on to other things. We used Mustafa Barat, who was from Morocco, and Juan Cobo, and for those. And then I think we hired Adam Teichman just to do the special effects because he had his Mitchell camera. So those, I did 4 altogether. Yeah, 4.
I know.
I think Mike Spira did some stuff too. He did some stuff as well. So we had 2 people. Victor Ginsburg, I think his name was, for the 30 stuff. Mike Spira, and then for the later shoot for the 80s footage was Mustafa Barat, Juan Cobo, and Adam Teichman for the special effects. So a lot of people.
Glorious Technicolor Festival takes place in '88, right?
Yes.
All right. So you're at Paramount Theater in Peekskill. Now, how does this go? You kind of talked about this a little bit before, but you're putting the chronology into perspective now. So you shot Space Avenger at the Paramount Theater prior to the filming of the prior to the festival, and then it actually screened at the festival.
Get the whole thing ready for my Technicolor thing. We had a Technicolor festival before we premiered the movie. So and I just called up all my film collector friends, and we brought over the Technicolor prints, and we're kind of promoting the process, which also later helped promote Space Avenger, and of course I ended up writing a book about it. The chronology is I wrote a book after the movie, not before the movie. What happened is when I went to China and I just kept researching this, I gathered so much information, I said maybe I should write a book about this, and I did. Before that, just to make sure I could pull it off, I wrote some articles as well, so I just kind of fell into it. I wasn't planning to become a film historian writer, but I just fell into it, and I liked it.
Back to the festival though, there's some pretty good films that were screened there, right? So you got Around the World in 80 Days. Yep. What else was brought in that was contributed to? And
memory serves, I didn't pull up that information. We screened Music Man, Around the World in 80 Days. I think we screened Lawrence of Arabia. Let me think. What else? I don't have it in front of me. I think we definitely screened those ones. And different people introduced them. I introduced the Music Man and Around the World in 80 Days. Other people introduced the other ones. Oh, West Side Story. That was another one we screened.
let's talk casting then for a minute. So with you've always mentioned that actors you're hiring are on their way up or they're on their way down, and this is Space Avenger is a good instance of a lot of actors that are on their way up. You got Robert Pritchard, you got Mike McCleary, and then you have Gina Mastrogiacomo.
Well, some of them were people I worked with already. I'd already worked with Robert Pritchard and on class of Nuke Em High and Michael McCleary. I had done the sound work on Mother's Day, the sound effects and sound editing, and Ray Sunman was one of the producers, and he brought along Michael McCleary. So these were people we knew already and trusted and would hang in there. And Gina, this was a casting call, and I thought she was pretty athletic and stuff. I thought she would be best for the film. It worked out good for her because after I made Technicolor prints of the film, I gave one to Scorsese. I screened it with him, and he liked Gina, and he ended up using it for Goodfellas.
So that's where
she came out pretty good for her.
So you acquainted Scorsese with her then? That's how he first saw her.
Actually,
then?
for about 2 years, I went through his whole film collection and fixed it up and cleaned it and screened it and rated it before it went to the George Eastman house. So I had a contact there for a while.
Yeah, you gave him some. I know you gave him one of your Prince Alien Space Avenger, but you also were you around? Are you involved? Where were you involved with the film restoration stuff that Scorsese had worked on at that time? Were you involved in any of that stuff at all?
No, I wasn't involved in any of his restorations.
Oh, okay.
I was involved with Bob Harris's by just finding him some footage. I loaned him a Technicolor print of Lawrence of Arabia, and I found him a British print of Spartacus when he was doing that, and I said, hey, check this out. It's got a different ending. And they said, really? Yeah, it had a different ending where she's begging him to die on the cross and stuff. So I said, it's a British print. So he went looking in England and found that piece of negative and was able to put that back in. So I did a little bit of work on those, but I didn't work on any of the Scorsese films, other than I did screen and fix up the print of One Eye Jacks, which he used as a reference when he later restored the film from the negative. So I do recall screening that particular print of his.
Now back to Gina though. What was her audition? What was her audition like? Because this is coming up.
Well, we do these cattle calls basically.
All right, I'm following.
We put an ad in the paper. There was two of them back then, backstage and showbiz, and we say what we're looking for, and they just come in groups. And what I say to do is to prepare a monologue, a 1 or 2 minute monologue, just so I can see what you look and sound like, and then we just keep weeding them down each time. But the other trick with this, I wanted someone who was kind of athletic, because she would be running around a lot, and so she had some experience in that, and I thought she was the best one for the role, so we hired her. She was easy to work with too. So.
All right. Well, I'm curious again. So back on some special effects. You mentioned some stuff earlier, but how did the process go? How did you create some of the regenerating limbs, like in a little more detail, and then the pictures you sent with the infamous headless lady and stuff.
I storyboard the film. I say exactly what we're looking for, and then the special effects guys they take pieces of clay and they mold these things, and then from there they make a cast of it, and from the cast they pour the latex in there, and then that's how the effect is done. And they put bladders in there that expand, like balloons that expand, so they can throb and all this kind of stuff. So it's thin latex stuff, almost like the stuff you see at Don Post masks. That's the stuff it's made out of. And but in their case, they had to put mechanics in there, so the mechanical hand had to move, the fingers had to move, and stuff like that. They had to break through layers of latex when the head is popping out and stuff like that. So it's complicated, and you got to do tests of them, and then you shoot them and see how it comes out. And if it doesn't work, you try it again. But they have the mold, so if it doesn't work, they can just make another cast and do that again. But these are the practical effects, not digital back then. There was no digital. These are actual rubber mechanical things, I guess, props that look real. You got to light them the right way too. So that's how they're done, called practical effects back then. Latex.
You talk about whether or not it's kind of a trial and error process. No, actually, with Space Avenger, how was the trial and error process of this? Were there a lot of complications, or is it expeditious?
You just don't know if the effect's going to work.
That's what I mean. That's what I'm asking.
Remake it and shoot it again.
Yeah.
Because you have a lot of mechanics going there. You have bladders that are throbbing and making the thing throb. You have blood squirting out. In terms of the head effect, everybody wants to know how we did the severed head effect.
Yeah.
I think I showed you the picture of it. We showed it from the back, and a woman's head is way down, leaning down, and we have a prop shoulders and a stump on her back. And so from the angles we do, and it looks like she's running around with a severed head with blood squirting out, but her head is actually, if you saw the front of her, it's leaning way down, and on top of her neck is the stump. That's how that was done.
All right. So it's just from that makes sense now, because it's like right from the behind shots going in the hallway.
If you see the front, you see that her head was down, but it looked real enough. The effects artists and some assistants here with these little pumps and levers that are making these things happen all the time. It's kind of wild. I wish we had an actual photo of it, of how they're doing this, so you have the actual effect, and underneath there are a whole bunch of technicians here, squirting blood and doing all kinds of stuff through hoses and pumps. It's like a little team underneath there making these things work. So I wish I'd had a shot of that because it would have been funny to show.
Well, let's talk about the premiere of Space Avenger. This was unique in that your focus was concentrated on the entire cinematic experience. Put this into perspective for me.
We were lucky enough to shoot at a movie palace, and then he premiered it there. I knew the guy. Robert Frischmuth was one of the guys who worked on the film, too. He's one of the associate producers, so he got us a lot of the peaks. I think he got us all the Peekskill locations, and he was the programmer at the Paramount at the time, and he had bought some... what were they? Norelco 70mm 35 projectors, so he could premiere almost any format. And I worked with him. Actually, how I met him is he was doing a premiere. His first movie he showed there, I kind of saved him. He was showing That's Entertainment, and their amp didn't work. So I rushed to my projection booth and at my home cinema and brought over the amp so he could play the movie there. And then we became friends, and he helped me on the movie, and of course we did the 3D festival there and he premiered it there.
Speaking on the more technological aspects of the film then, so you've talked about some of the special effects and earlier, especially some of the cinematographic process of using, but let's talk about the dye transfer process and let's jump there. So let's go forward towards Beijing.
Okay, Technicolor.
Yeah.
Okay, well, contrary to what people think, this was not shot in 3-strip Technicolor. That no film after 1955 was shot in 3-strip Technicolor. The Technicolor process had adapted itself to Eastman colors. This was shot in Eastman color, and then it was printed in the dye transfer process. So what's that mean? Well, rather than just make a print from a print, which is how it's done in regular labs, they take your camera negative and they make what's called 3 matrices. They print the negative through a filter that photographs just one color on this special black and white stock, but when they process it, it's sticking out of the image like a rubber stamp. It's almost like a rubber stamped impression on film.
Okay.
Then they add dye to that, and it's layered. It's just wiped on layer by layer. It's done with the lights on, so you can actually see the layers being wiped on. And the advantage is they use ink-based dyes, and it just never fades. But also it has a much more rich color. The dyes are more richer than they are in Eastman color. So even if you're shooting in Eastman color, if you make a dye transfer print of it, it's going to look more vibrant than it did if you made an Eastman color print from the same negative.
Yeah.
And they never fade, which is an advantage. And also, you're talking about mass-produced first-generation prints.
Yeah.
That's the only process that was able to do that. The matrices are always made right off the camera negative, so you're mass-producing the quality of a first-generation print. Whereas other films, they only make a handful of first-generation prints. You damage a negative. Most prints are made off a duplicate negative, and then, of course, you add grain and dust and stuff like that, so they don't look as good.
Well, that's what you talked about in the book about it, saying it's the second and third generation prints really had suffered from a lot of that.
Most prints by then in the 80s were what's called third generation high-speed prints. The labs were so tacky, they'd made a fine-grain positive, then a duplicate negative, and then they mass-produced prints from the duplicate negative at high speeds, like 2,000 feet a minute. You're not going to get a good exposure at that speed, so the prints had a kind of a grainy, murky look. Unless you went to one of the large screen cinemas in the urban areas and they made a print right off the camera negative. And it's a little bit of a cheat. The critics always saw a camera negative print. Audiences saw, in most cases, certainly in the multiplexes, third generation prints on a high-speed printer. And in some cases, there was barely an image on the film. It was so quickly processed. So, of course, that was the optimum quality, but it was very expensive. So.
That was when you had it was where you were referring to that it had kind of a screening become kind of an exhibition, become kind of an elitist thing at that point, right?
Yeah, it was. Unless you went to one of like block theaters on 3rd Avenue in New York City or the Lowe's Astor Plaza or someplace like that, the prints you saw were crap. If you went to a general megaplex or multiplex, they were terrible.
Well,
and everybody knew it. They didn't seem to care.
Is that why the Chinese took it then because the technology from British Technicolor, because they were interested? Is this why they were interested in making those mass prints and it was more cost effective to them as to where the process had changed in the U.S. and in other places where people were making less prints, so it was more expensive.
From England, I assume they bought it because they liked the way it looked. It looked good. And if you go to China, it's a very colorful architecture and stuff there, so it just looked really good. And of course you're able to Technicolor, believe it or not, is actually cheaper if you're mass producing a print from a set of matrices. It's not cheaper if you're just making a few at a time or whatever.
Yeah.
So you can make 400 prints per set of matrices. So if you want 800 prints, then you make 2 sets of matrices. So that's how it works. But you can't make, if you want optimum quality in Eastman color, you can't make 800 prints off your camera negative. You'd trash it. So you're stuck with a duplicate negative, and it just quite frankly doesn't look as good.
Now that's okay. Then we're in the right path. And that's what I thought they needed the technology. I had read a couple of I know I forget her name, Kirsty Dutzen or something. Was her name, I believe, and had done some research on Technicolor in the 90s, going over there, and was some of the article had mentioned that the reason that they had used it was for the availability of the mass printing being cost effective and on top of the color. But back to Space Avenger now with. you mentioned an Ariflex camera was used for filming. So explain this to me in the digital age. So why was this choice made? Explain this.
You actually get better quality if you shoot in Eastman color than make a Technicolor print. The trouble with the 3-strip process is that they can do it better now digitally. If you want to superimpose them, there's always a little bit of a fringe. If you're shooting the 3-strip camera, for people don't know, they actually shot 3 separate negatives in a big camera, one photographing each of the primary colors, but then you have to superimpose 3 separate images, and you can have some fringing and problems like that, whereas you go from Eastman color, you're going from a single strip. Excuse me, and when you make your matrices, it'll have excellent registration. And to be quite honest, the Eastman color negatives had more latitude in terms of exposure. It was easy to shoot with them. You could do more creative lighting and stuff like that. The 3-strip Technicolor camera, you had the blast light just to get the exposure on 3 separate negatives.
Yeah, apparently those Klieg lights baked people back in the day, right? They were really hot.
Yeah, right, yeah. It was so hot the makeup would melt and stuff like that, where you could even do low lighting. Like The Godfather was dye transfer Technicolor, and they shot the whole thing like at f2 with almost no light. Was that you have pitch black, so it filled in the grain somewhat.
So Godfather 2 is the last thing brought out in Technicolor before your film in the U.S. Am I correct in that, or am I jumping here?
The last new film printed in Technicolor, they did do one last run of a reissue just before they shut down in 75 of Disney's Swiss Family Robinson, which is sort of interesting because he was the first one to use 3-strip Technicolor with flowers and trees back in 1932 and the last one to use it in 1975. Then the British Technicolor Lab kept on using dye transfer printing through 78. That's why there's actual dye transfer prints of Jaws and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Star Wars over there, whereas the American prints all faded. Those remain intact. Then the Technicolor Lab in the U.S. insisted the British lab shut it down. They didn't want to, but they forced them to. So they sold the equipment to China, and China set it up there. But unfortunately, they shut it down in 93. I was going to do Head Games in Dye Transfer 2, and it's even in the credits. But they shut it down before I could do it. Then in 1997 through 2001, for reasons I don't know, they decided to bring back dye transfer printing, very briefly in the U.S. Made new Technicolor prints of Apocalypse Redux. They also did some classics, Wizard of Oz, and Gone with the Wind, and Beatty used it in Bulworth, and then they shut it down again. Oh, Rear Window, too. And then they shut it down again in 2001, and that was it. I don't know if the stuff still exists, or they junked it all, who knows. Technicolor doesn't even do prints anymore, most of the labs.
You had talked about, though, at some point you've mentioned in some articles I had read, I feel like, about this being kind of an intentional outmoding, though, of the process. Am I right? Am I right in this?
Say it again?
About the intentional outmoding, like trying to get, like, the kind of, phasing out, making the process obsolete over time. There was an intentional aspect.
The industry decided to dump film over time. However, at least they should save all the negatives because that still gives you the best quality. Even if you're digitally scanning it in, it's much better to have a negative to scan that you can scan in whatever format you want, 2K, 4K, 8K. If you shoot something digitally, you're stuck with that pixel count for all time. And there's no way of really saving a digital file. You have to output it back to film if you want it to last. And there's no permanent digital file. They keep changing them. You have a piece of plastic with the image on there and stick it in storage. You can use that forever. So I still advocate anybody shooting digitally to output it back to film so you have a hard copy of your image.
Well, now that said, you at some point, with archival, you have talked about Laserdisc. You're an advocate for Laserdisc at some point in your life, haven't you been?
Well, I was when it came out. It turns out it wasn't archival. Everybody thought it was, and it wasn't. In fact, that was the big pitch, that it would last forever as a format. But no, it turns out it deteriorated over time. Leonard Nimoy was a big pitchman for that way back when, if you remember. It was kind of funny. And I put out a disc. I did narration for a disc called the Archival Film Disc, which is sort of a history of cinema through trailers, and I narrated it and stuff. But I suspected it would deteriorate over time, so I switched it to a gold DVD for long-term preservation. In terms of DVD, well, again, they keep changing the formats, DVD, Blu-ray, now 4K. I don't know how stable they are, to be quite honest. They seem to be lasting for a while, certainly better than the old Laserdiscs. But the only reliable ones, I guess, are the gold ones. Gold doesn't rust or oxidize.
Yeah, and
they don't make them for consumers. They only make that for private use.
As I was saying, and that stuff, like, I had to actually look this up. So, like, I feel like the tangibility of film is almost disappearing altogether within the next generation with streaming and stuff. Maybe that's just an opinion, but with the gold disc, these things last up to like 300 years, correct? I mean, I had to do a little research to figure this out.
The only trouble is if the format is obsolete, what are you going to do with it?
That was my other question. Yeah, is you got the disc? What the hell? It's kind of like that record floating around in space.
And you have nothing to play it back in, so that's the danger there. But I'm trying to keep up. I keep my data on gold discs, both CD and the visual stuff on on the DVD gold discs, and when something else comes out, I'll try that. There's some new. I forgot the name of it. It's a new format. It's not commercial yet. It's, I think, a glass disc with the information embedded in that, and they claim it'll last 1,000 years, which is great. But again, the trouble is, the format, the playback ability, when they keep changing all the digital formats, so you can have a disc or some sort of data that will last forever, but there's no way of playing it back because they've changed the formats. The advantage of film, you got a film in an archive, you just keep scanning in that image whenever you want for the future.
When did your interest in Technicolor lead you to begin research on the process?
When I went to NYU, I'd been watching films. The only way I could see a film, of course, I saw them in theaters, but they were kind of phasing out Technicolor in the 70s. And when I went to NYU, I was like in film buff heaven because they had all these revival theaters, the Regency, A Street Playhouse, Bleecker Street, Carnegie Hall Cinema, the Elgin, a whole bunch of others that were playing classics in Technicolor, and I just fell in love with the process. Also, I went to the Museum of Modern Art, had two really spectacular festivals, the David O. Selznick Festival and the Michael Powell Festival, showing archival prints in Technicolor, nitrate Technicolor in some cases, of their films, and I said, wow, this is just so awesome. So I started researching that, and simultaneously, in 79, 1980, they started having all these articles saying that the Eastman color prints were fading away. So I kept looking into it and to see if there was something I could do about it in the long run. And I took advantage of it when I found that China offered it, and they said, come on over. And we made some prints there, and it was very interesting.
Now, with Splatter U, though, that was actually shot on Eastman color, too. So how do you preserve that now going into the future?
Oh, well, that was my only film. There was two types of Eastman color stock. Pre-1983 Eastman color stock is called quick fade.
All right.
And the rate of fading is based on how good the storage is and how good the processing was. So I kept it in cold storage. It didn't fade hardly at all. And I made a low fade interpositive of it when that became available after 83. All my other films are shot on low fade Eastman color, and they're holding up fine. And they're in an archive anyway, cold storage. So post-83 Eastman color is pretty stable. Pre-83 Eastman color is very unstable, but again, the rate of fading is based on how good the original processing was. I was fortunate. I used DuArt, which was a good lab for Splatter University, so it was only like 10% faded when I made a new IP and low fade stock. Other labs like Deluxe with the pits, and they faded within 20 years. I found out when he tried to reissue Star Wars, it was like 50% faded in only 20 years because Deluxe was such a bad lab and processed the film so sloppily and left the processing chemicals on there and started to deteriorate the emulsion.
It's interesting. I watched was a Schatzberg film the other night, Panic in Needle Park, and that's shot in Deluxe, I believe. I think, and it really desaturated. So, I didn't know that stuff went down the tube that fast. But
well, it depends on the lab. Metrocolor was pretty good. They faded slowly. Let's see, Deluxe was bad. Movie Lab was bad. Pathé Color was bad. These were really bad. Gafanti was good. It depends on the lab. The key when you're processing Eastman color is you got to wash off the processing chemicals afterwards. You can't leave them on there because they start acting as a corrosive to the emulsion. Some labs did it. Some labs didn't care.
Where does creating Space Avenger eclipse the idea to write a book about the dye transfer process developed by Technicolor?
When I discovered I could do that, the Chinese actually came and visited me on my set. They gave me some suggestions on how to light it to make it look saturated, and I thought it would be really... The original idea was just to print the 1930 sequences in Technicolor, so like they landed in the Technicolor movie and they come back in an Eastman color movie, but then they offered to do the whole thing, so we did the whole thing. So right from the beginning, I wanted to do it in the process when we started shooting.
All right,
and again, they were on the set with me. They came by and they gave me some suggestions and stuff. You can use special gels and filters and stuff to give you a really saturated look. Also, the color red looks good, so I put Doris, who's the alien hooker, in red, because red's always associated with prostitution, and it really glows on the screen.
In your book, the story, the way that you the book is very technical, but it also goes through, it develops, this sort of storyline to it with, but much of the early material that you had to research, a lot of this stuff, like Toll of the Season stuff, this stuff's been lost, right? I mean, even with the archival stuff that you put on Laserdisc, like, didn't you put like some La Cucaracha on there and stuff like that? So, like, what were some of the challenges that you faced?
They made brand new 60mm Technicolor prints on that, so I put it on there. Yeah.
Well, what were some of the challenges that you faced uncovering the history of these two-strip processes?
I had a lot of film collector friends, and I had archival friends, and I just kept asking, and with contact with Eastman House and stuff. So you just gotta check around to see who has what. Film collectors are fascinating. They had all kinds of stuff that everybody thought was lost.
Yeah.
So that's where they found a lot of lost footage. They found the lost footage of A Star Is Born, a film collector. Take that out of the garbage can at Warner Brothers, rather.
Yeah, that's what I even read. Like a lot of the early Buster Keaton films were found. Like some of them, there was a lot of lost footage found in his old house, right? One of his old homes.
It was sad. He was felt so forgotten about. He had kept prints of most of his films, and he just left them in his house when James Mason bought them, and James Mason contacted Raymond Rohauer. He just left his prints behind, and in some cases, these were the only surviving nitrate copies. However, the Cohen Group has done a full restoration of the Keaton stuff, and they look better than I've ever seen them before. It turns out they did find duplicate negatives on nitrate and stuff overseas, so it's much better than the earlier Kino stuff. So I recommend those. They look great.
Before writing Technicolor, you initially wrote articles on the subject for Perfect Vision, most of which is used in your book. What sort of response did you receive from these articles after they were published?
Well, I got such a good response, I just sent them to McFarland, and they said, okay, write the book. I wanted to make sure I could get a publisher first, so I said, I wrote these 2 articles. How about I write a whole book about them? And they said, yeah, and that was it, and it was actually very easy. Now, there was an earlier book about Technicolor, but it only covered the 3-strip years. It didn't cover the post-3-strip years from 55 on, so that's what I focused my book on. And I actually like those films. I think they look better than the 3-strip ones. The 3-strip ones are very pretty, but they have kind of a fantasized look, and when you get into the dye transfer printing of the 50s and 60s, I thought they look more realistic and they look better. Films like Lawrence of Arabia, Hitchcock's Vertigo, North by Northwest, they look very pretty, but they had a more realistic look than the 3-strip ones, which are sort of fantasized, which is fine, but I happen to prefer the other looks, the ones shot in Eastman color, especially the ones shot in a large format negative like VistaVision and then reduction printed to dye transfer prints. They're so sharp you can cut them with a knife. The Hitchcock ones, for example. So,
in your, I'm going to deviate for a second here. In your research, you discuss kinescope some. So, I've always kind of been curious. I've known a little bit for a while about Desi Arnaz and kind of the history of transferring kinescope into film or onto film, and actually so they would be able to hold and retain the quality of it longer, something like that. Now, how much of the early effort to deviate away from kinescope are Carl Friend and Desi Arnaz actually responsible for?
Well, Desi and Lucy are really responsible for moving TV into production in 35 millimeter. Before that, everything was live, and the only way to make a record of it, to re-show it, was to literally film off a TV set. They filmed off sometimes you can even see the edge of the screen. They filmed off a TV set with a modified 16 millimeter camera. And you got a record of it. It's better than nothing for a live broadcast, but it didn't look good. And so from what I read is they wanted to do the Lucy show that way, and he insisted. I said, no, I want to shoot it in 35 millimeter film to get optimum quality, especially for reruns. And they said no. So he said, okay, I'll pay for it, but I get the rerun rights. And they said, okay. And he made a fortune.
And so syndicated television was born.
Yeah, right. And, of course, the other thing he did very cleverly, both of them did, is they created Desilu. And for those who don't know, Desilu is just RKO. They bought out RKO and renamed it Desilu. So they had all these standing sets and stuff to use for other TV shows. And that became the norm then after that. It looked so good and was so successful, especially for reruns, that most shows were shot in 35 millimeter in the 50s through the 60s. Then they made a bad decision in the 70s, which Norman Lear was promoting, which is shoot them on videotape. And the videotape deteriorates and doesn't look good, and it's not an archival format, and so the show shot on tape looked pretty terrible compared to the one shot on film now. Then it went back to film in the 80s.
Though, you mentioned RKO. Didn't Lucille Ball, did she sell it to General Tire? Or where's the transition from there? Because it's Selznick.
No, Howard Hughes went through a lot of hands. At one point, Howard Hughes had it.
Yeah.
He was just playing with it. He was just having fun. Then he got bored with it and decided to go into Las Vegas, and he sold it to General Tire. And
that's who he sold it to. Okay.
And then I believe the studio itself was bought by Desi and Ricky, and they just adapted it for TV use. And then it was all demolished and torn down in the long run. Nothing lasts in Hollywood.
As a legacy equipment filmmaker, how is the industrial transition to digital filmmaking a motivation for you to pivot towards writing novels as opposed to screenplays? Because you started picking up a lot of the novel work, and I know that you've said that a lot of the adaptations of your novels were originally, you kind of have tried to pitch them as screenplays or ideas.
Well, my novels would have been my next movies, but everything, the transition to digital just wiped out the whole independent filmmaking on film in the New York area. For example, when I was doing What Really Frightens You, I think I was shooting it in 2007, the last film process at LabLink was my film. They were all shutting down. Then the mixing studio shut down, and the lab shut down, and there was nothing left here. So, and New York is really the independent, the place to make independent films. If you go to Hollywood, everything's going to be twice as expensive, and that's a studio town. So it's difficult to impossible to make low-budget films out there. And I'm not even sure that many labs left anyway. So since they got out of that, I went my books would have been in my movies, so I just made them into novels instead. And a screenplay is sort of like a novel anyway. Just you write it a little differently if you're going to make it into a novel.
That's true. I mean, how have they been received over the years? Because in the beginning, in the beginning you started.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's obviously not as lucrative as making a movie, and you have all these different markets. I'm still trying to sell them to somebody to adapt them into making a digital movie or whatever. So I would love to sell them someday. I wish it was a way of me making them into movies, but film is not making a comeback, and I'm a filmmaker, so I had to move on.
Would you be interested?
I still got my movies. I'm never out of it because I'm still marketing my movies. I have 7 movies. I used to joke, 007. I made 7 movies, 7 books.
Yeah.
So I still market them, so I'll always be doing that. But I'm not making any new movies, obviously, because it's impossible to shoot on film. And nobody even knows what's going to go on in the film business now because after COVID, half the theaters have folded. So everything's up in the air now. It'll be interesting to see what happens, to see if theatrical even survives.
Yeah, sure. We have a local movie palace here. Well, a couple of them in the area, actually. But one of them there, and they've had to do a lot of fundraising. They, because they've had to do something. They restored the theater.
Right.
It was a Cinerama back in the 70s, and then of course, or up until the 70s when the process died, and they, it just kind of became a white coat shop overnight sort of place for a while until it was revitalized back in the 90s, and they put it all back together. But because of that, it's a nonprofit now. But they do a lot of.
That's the only way in terms of big things. There's going to have to be some sort of nonprofit or part stage, part film. The Movie Palace as a general exhibition is gone for good. And they don't really make movies suited for it. They still have the Cinerama screen in that theater, or they tear it down?
I don't believe they do anymore. There's no arc screen for it. Now they still have the booths because they ran the process. My knowledge on this compared to yours is obviously minimal. But you talk about the 3 booth process. There's 3 different booths.
Yeah, that was the original Cinerama from 52 through 62, where they had they shot with 3 cameras and 3 booths, and they each showed 1/3 of the film.
And that's how they did it here.
Gigolos in the projector to blur the join lines, but you still saw them. They look better now digitally because they got rid of the join lines. And then in 63, they basically switched to Todd AO. They called it Cinerama.
Yeah.
Because Todd AO, the Michael Todd process, was 70 millimeter shown on a curved screen. They just switched to it and called it Cinerama, but it was really just Todd AO.
Well, that's where that Sovscope, like there's one Sovscope production that you talked about that was like they mimicked the Todd AO process basically, right?
So yeah, they did Sovscope. They did 70 millimeter. The Sovscope was actually 70 millimeter, and Kino Panorama was their version of Cinerama. Identical, of course.
Yeah.
There wasn't really much to patent on Cinerama. I mean, anybody can take 3 cameras and shoot 1/3 of the image. Mm-hmm. So it was easy to kind of just steal it, but why would you? It's too complicated and cumbersome. Not that I don't like the Cinerama films; they're a lot of fun, but it's much easier to shoot with a single lens. With a good depth of field, and then show it on a curved screen afterwards, rather than trying to make 3 images blend into one. I saw Cinerama in optimum conditions when they revived it in, I think it was 1997 in Ohio, and they showed How the West Was Won, and this is Cinerama in Technicolor. And as good as it looked and spectacular, those panel joins didn't match, and I was staring at the join lines a lot of times, so it was a flawed process. Now, when they released them digitally, they blended those join lines, and you really don't see them anymore, so it actually looks better now than it did when it was originally released.
Yeah, that's what this is. Cinerama struggled when it came out, too, didn't it? It wasn't really very well received, was it?
No, it was a smash hit.
It was a smash hit, so I'm backwards.
But simply not pragmatic. It was only playing in a couple of theaters. So they were desperate to find something similar. That people like the widescreen imagery, but they wanted to find something similar. So everything in the 50s was actually old, just revived and repackaged very cleverly. I mean, even Cinerama wasn't new. Abel Gance did a 3-panel climax of Napoleon triptych, which is similar, not on a curved screen, but on a flat screen. CinemaScope, which Daryl Zanuck introduced, was nothing but an old process from France. They made a couple of films in the silent era. It didn't really click, so we actually bought those lenses and rushed them over and made the robe and How to Marry a Millionaire. Claimed it was something new, but it was old. 3D had been used in New York World's Fair and other venues. It had 3D in the silent era, too. Some red and blue 3D films, so that wasn't new. 70 millimeter wasn't new. 70 millimeter was introduced in 1930, but because of the Depression, it didn't really catch on, but that was an old format, too, reintroduced. So most of the 50 stuff, as much fun as it is, was actually old stuff just revived and reintroduced.
Well, when did the interest in 3D develop, and what was unique about this filming process when you used it for the movie Run for Cover?
Okay, well, 3D, 2 things happened. When I was in high school, I got into an X-rated film, even though I was only 16, Paul Morrissey's Frankenstein, Flesh for Frankenstein, released as Andy Warhol's Frankenstein. It really blew me away. I really thought it was really fascinating. And then, again, at the 8th Street Playhouse in 1980-81, they had a 3D festival playing all the 50s classic films like House of Wax and Kiss Me Kate. And I really liked it. So I said, I want to try to bring this back or do one. So I did find a guy with the lenses who could do a single lens system similar to Frankenstein, but better lenses, stereo vision, and it was Chris Condon who had made the first 3D porn film, Stewardesses, but he wanted to do a mainstream project. So we kind of partnered, and he gave me his lenses, and I made Run for Cover in 1995, and this is when nobody else was making 3D films. So again, that was another marketing gimmick, so to speak, but I had fun doing it. And we got booked all over the country. The only trouble there, unlike Technicolor, where you just give them the print and they show it, I had to set up each theater for it. So that was kind of cumbersome, but it was still fun.
Yeah, so how did that go? What's the process behind setting that up? I was kind of curious. How does this go?
Okay, well, first you need to have a silver screen. Some theaters have it already, but if you don't, you have to install one.
Okay.
Because it's a polarized system. You need the two lenses on your glasses have to be reflected off a silver screen to separate the images. So you have to install a silver screen, even if it's temporary, and take it down. And then you have what's called a split lens. That what a 3D image looks like, the modern version, is it's two images, one on top of the other. And this lens superimposes the top image onto the bottom with the filters. And so you have to put those lenses on all the cameras, all the projectors rather, with a silver screen, and then give out the 3D glasses, which are polarized glasses. So it's kind of cumbersome, but it is a lot of fun.
I mean, at the time, were you able to accommodate for it relatively easily? I mean,
not easily, but we did it.
Yeah.
Each theater had to be set up. We had to check it. We had one problem with a theater in Texas. I remember I said, once it's set up, don't take it down. They said, we like to play trailers. I said, no, do not play trailers, flat trailers, and try to put this all back on afterwards. And so he did it, and he was calling me panicking at night. He didn't know how the thing worked. I said, I told you, don't take the lens off. Once it's on there, only show the 3D thing. Don't show trailers that are flat and try to set it up again afterwards.
Yeah.
So otherwise, it worked out fine. Also, I get to travel around the world. The Russians called me up, and they wanted to play it there, so we premiered into Moscow, and I got a free trip to Moscow, and I saw their stereo kino cameras. Their 3D system was 70 millimeter with images side by side in each other, two square images rather than above, under, and 35. And I got to go to Israel, too. I co-sponsored a 3D festival there, the parliament there, and at Tel Aviv. And I showed my film, but we also showed Darling for Murder and Coming At You. I forgot what else we showed there. Anyway, so I sponsored a 3D festival there. So, again, I got to travel the world, which is always fun.
Interview back from 2000. I forget where I read it, but you talked about collaborating with your mother in your work in the film, too. She wrote a screenplay or something or something like that, right?
No. That was my father. He wrote the text for my book. My parents worked on all my films, but no, my father wrote the text for Animal Kingdom book. My mother didn't actually write any of the screenplay.
Oh, I must have misread.
They helped me in the films. They helped me. They made food for the crew. Sometimes they crashed out in our house.
All right.
In the basement, there would be all these crew members sleeping there and stuff, whatever. So.
All right. So your parents have been pretty involved. They were pretty involved in your work.
Yeah, not only that, but that's where the screening room is. You wanted to ask about the screening room.
Really?
They have
So
a
it's
really elaborate screening room, literally set up for everything in their basement with a 10-foot screen. I have a booth that can play 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, and digital, also Cinerama, also 3D, dual projector polarized. The way that came about is when I was doing, it just happened over time, when I was doing Splatter and Space Avenger, it was costing me a lot of money to actually rent a screening room in the city to screen daily. So I said, well, what if I just create one? So I bought a cheap 35 millimeter DeVry projector for $500 and a 16 projector for $100. And right there, I saved money. And then we just created a booth and the screen there, and then it got more and more elaborate as I added equipment and eventually went digital and all that. So I can show anything now.
What prints do you have that you like to watch? You prefer if you spend the time?
Well, I mostly watch Blu-rays, and I have prints in my movies.
Oh, okay.
I rarely watch prints anymore. I mostly watch the Blu-rays, and I screen whatever I feel like. We just had a Cinerama thing. We played the Cinerama Russian Adventure on the curved screen, and the Best of Cinerama recently, which was fun.
Well, what about
you're right close to the screen. It's a curved screen right in front of you. You're 15 feet away. You feel like it's a real Cinerama experience because you're so close to the screen.
Well, what about your catalog? Now, as far as distribution and getting it out there, what tangible format does it exist in? I talked to you earlier, talked about saying that Splatter University was...
What are you talking about, Run for Cover?
No, just any of them. I mean, I've struggled to be able to source a lot of tangible copies. I know that Soft Money Soft Money streams, but I haven't seen a physical copy of that either. But I know, for instance...
Well, I mean, we had a lot of these things out there. The deals expired, so we're always looking for new deals, so they come and go. We recently... I mean, I've been making a lot of international sales. We distributed Splatter University in a number of foreign areas recently. We just whatever we can. We make a deal, and the deal's expired, and they go out of release until we find another deal. Most deals are 5 to 7 years. So most of the films, those old deals expired, so we're trying to find new ones.
Yeah, that's what the Splatter, the copy. I've seen a couple of versions of Splatter, but the one I had seen recently was on Blu-ray.
The best one is the Vinegar Syndrome one because they
that's the one
directly from the 16 negative. The British one is pretty good too, but they went from the 16 IT, the interpositive, rather than the camera negative. Mostly because I didn't want to send a camera negative over there. So the other one, I just came and went with it when they did the Vinegar Syndrome, and were they in Jersey or something? I came and went with it, and they did it right off the negative. So that's the best quality one in terms of visually, considering that it's a 16 millimeter film and doesn't look as good as the 35.
Going forward, so you mentioned your interest in Tarantino's work on The Hateful Eight in the previous interview, where he was, I know he refurbished some of these Panavision 70 lenses, right, used in the films like Ben-Hur. Now, aside from...
Yeah, the Ultra Panavision, which is 70 millimeter with a 25% anamorphic squeeze, which gives you an incredible 2.76 to 1 aspect ratio.
Yeah, with the D squeeze. I was actually kind of curious because I'm a little more familiar with like digital lensing as far as the anamorphic lens, and the D squeezing process is obviously totally different now than it was back then. How did that work back then?
I think the Ultra Panavision used mirrors for the squeeze rather than the lens. CinemaScope used an actual anamorphic lens, and I'm pretty sure they used some sort of mirror to give you that extra little squeeze there. I don't really know why he shot it in Ultra Panavision. There's really no theater set up for it, but it was interesting. It looked good. I'm glad he tried to bring the process back, and it looked like it was making a comeback because other people were using it, but now nobody's shooting on film anymore, so I guess it died again, but I'm glad at least someone tried to bring it back. He a little bit like me, he had this vision of doing 70, I had a vision of doing 3D and Technicolor, so I always admire anybody who tries to put their vision out there, even if it's only temporary and not long-term, but I'm not sure anything's long-term in the film business. Anyway, good for him that he was able to do it, and I saw it I forgot where I saw it. The only problem is when I saw it is that they didn't mask off the screen properly, so there was extra white on top and bottom of the screen, which was annoying, but otherwise it looked really sharp.
It's kind of interesting to see, but I mean, aside from this, there's been a renewed interest. Like you said, there has been at some point over the past, like, I'd say, I don't know where it is now, but I know like back 5 or 6 years ago, there was a lot of interest with the Arri Alexa 65 introduced in 2014, and a lot of 65 millimeter production resulted from that. So like, what were your thoughts on this at the time?
It has a renewed interest, and then it disappeared again. Almost everything comes and goes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's making a comeback though, because just again the equipment is not there. There was still theater set up for 70 when he did these. I don't know if any of them are anymore.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm not sure that many theaters are set up even for 35. So that's the only problem there. Is if you're going to revive a format, you need the actual equipment there in the theater. And if it's not there, I don't see how you're going to be able to do it. The advantage of 3D, I was just able to adapt the projectors that were there already, and of course Technicolor, you shoot it regular. With 70 millimeter, you need one of those 70-35 projectors. They play both.
Yeah.
And some theaters still had it. I'm not sure any of them do anymore.
No, there's still actually one. They run 70 millimeter reel here at the Hollywood Theater, the theater I was telling you about earlier, because they hype a print of Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey 2001 that they run pretty frequently. So they do release some.
All right, that's good. They still have some ones that can do that. I know the Cinerama Dome had it, but that shut down. So
yeah, they run 35 millimeter prints pretty regularly. But I mean, before the pandemic, they were airing them pretty regularly. I imagine they'll screen them again soon as well. But they also
I hope so. Yeah, there's nothing really around here. They used to be, but not around here anymore.
The one thing about out here is that the movie palace, like for instance, when the studios had bought them all up in the 40s and before the Paramount thing, came down, and what was that, 58, the lawsuit that came down and broke up the studios?
48,
okay.
They made them sell off the theater trains.
Yeah, but before, when they had everything blocked up like that, most of these, there was a strand in the Pacific Northwest, a whole chain of them, and they're still out here now, and a lot of them have been preserved. There's one actually out near Astoria. There's a film museum out there, too, that's pretty cool, because, they filmed, the Goonies, and Spielberg was out there.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And,
Astoria.
Yeah, there's a matching theater palace out there, our movie palace called the Liberty, and it's very very stylistically a lot of the aesthetic with the Spanish terracotta and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool. It's definitely an experience we're fortunate to have out here. I will say that.
Oh, I've never been there. I should check it out. I've been to the Astoria Museum, but not that particular theater.
Well. All right, Richard. Well, I want to thank you for everything you've contributed to this episode of The Ghost of Hollywood. I'm sorry that we had so many hang-ups in the beginning with the communication and connection stuff.
I hope you followed all this technical stuff. So,
if not, and we're gonna Reagan and I, as part of this episode, we usually review some stuff too, and we'll also go into some technical detail about because you have a lot of diagrams. For instance, reading Technicolor Movies reminded me of almost like the cinematic version of like QED by Richard Feynman. Like, that's how it was to me. Like, it had that kind of technical aspect for it. But
the only trouble with the movie-going experience, it's sort of downbeat. The Technicolor movie, most of it's a celebration of the process, and only at the end I say what happened. I made a mistake with the movie-going experience. Rather than celebrate what used to be, I mostly talk about its decline from beginning to end, and it's kind of a sad book, but at least it explains what happened and why.
yeah, that's what we feel like. We missed the whole thing. You know, we're sitting over here, like, watching Oklahoma and streaming The Searchers and stuff, and we're watching, like,
oh, yeah,
it'll never be the same for us.
They made a new 70mm print. I saw it at one of the block theaters on the east side and back in, what was it, 81 or 82 or something. So I was very lucky because I'm 63. I got to see all these restorations and the classics reprinted in 70mm. In 79, the Cinerama Theater in Broadway, which is long gone, had a Broadway on Broadway festival, and they showed 70mm prints, Paint Your Wagon, South Pacific, what else? Not West Side Story, My Fair Lady, and Camelot. And it was really spectacular to see it on a big curved screen there in 70mm.
Well, going forward, where are you at with your career today? I mean, you still sound like you're very involved as far as, you know, the writing.
Well, I'm still marketing all my stuff. I don't know if I'm doing anything else, but I'll market my 7 books and I'll market my 7 movies as long as I can. I won't make another movie. There's no way of doing it unless by some miracle they bring back film, then I'll do it. But otherwise, there's no way of doing it now. There's no technical end to back it up. There's no labs. There's no mixing studios. None of these things exist for film anymore, at least not on this coast. So.
Yeah, and do you know about what about the dye transfer process abroad? Is it dead entirely as far as you know?
It's dead completely.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's dead. I don't see anybody bringing it back because the emphasis is on digital projection now, not film projection. So.
Yeah, that's true. All right, well, I do appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Great, thank you, and send me a copy of it, and I'll put it on gold CD, rather.
Oh, yeah, we'll cut it up, make it sound pretty, and send it back to you. So, again, I appreciate you working with us through the technical difficulties earlier and coming to talk with us on The Ghost of Hollywood.
All right, thank you.
All right, well, you have a good evening.
A lot of fun. Thank you so much.
And there you have it, auteur and author Richard W. Haines discussing his cult classic film, Alien Space Avenger, as well as his book, Technicolor Movies, The History of Dye Transfer Printing. You're listening to The Ghost of Hollywood. I'm Miss Ragan here with Poxy Leonard.
And it's time for a quick break, but we will return to say goodbye shortly. This is The Undertones with Jump Boys. Stay tuned, suckers.
Crazy, they don't have no sense. Never get lost in coincidence. Never lost for words, now we shoot for the moon. Trying to make it with the girls who can't come to the rules. Jump boys, wild jump boys,
Jump Boys by the Undertones, right here on The Ghost of Hollywood. I'm your host, Poxy Leonard, with Miss Ragan, and according to the hands on the clock, the time has come to bring this episode to an end.
Poxy and I would like to thank our guest, director Richard W. Haines, for taking the time to speak with us about his 1989 film, Space Avenger, and his 1993 book, Technicolor Movies, The History of Dye Transfer Printing.
Oh, and by the way, I was digging through my notes during the break, and to clear up any confusion that, I may have caused earlier, it was Richard's wife, not his mother, who had written a screenplay for one of his films, so...
Struggling tonight, Poxy.
Yeah.
Paramount in 58, Cinerama flop, asking Richard if his mother wrote a screenplay. You're falling apart on me over here.
I know. I don't know what's wrong. It's all falling out of my brain.
I can see this.
Anyway, I've definitely hit the gaff button a few times tonight, but still, I have no excuses for that, and I apologize.
I'll forgive you this time.
Well, thank you.
Anyway, Richard's book on Technicolor, along with his work on the decline of cinema-going experience and his numerous novels, can all be found online, so you shouldn't have much difficulty unearthing them if you're interested in doing so.
And Technicolor is a great book for sure, There is so much to take away from it. Definitely a must-have for any cinephile out there trying to uncover more knowledge about the history of the film. I recommend sourcing Alien Space Avenger elsewhere if possible for the sake of quality, but at worst, you can find it for free on YouTube, and I'm telling you this because it is fairly difficult to find. So just search Alien Space Avenger, and hopefully it'll turn up.
We'd also like to thank our production manager, Mary Flannery, writer Chris Klon, and sound sampler Jesse Garcia for all of their dedication and hard work here at The Ghost of Hollywood. Also, another big thank you to KBOO Community Radio in Portland, Oregon for providing the space and support for the show, and to Hollywood Movie Madness for providing the necessary resources to develop this episode.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks to wrap up our very first season of The Ghost of Hollywood. To celebrate, our friend Fritz Kirsch, well known for his directorial work on the film Children of the Corn, will join us for our season finale celebration, where we will discuss his work on that movie and 1985's Tough Turf, starring James Spader and Robert Downey Jr.
For more information on The Ghost of Hollywood, please visit kboo.fm, check us out on social media, or visit our website at theghostofhollywoodpodcast.com. If you'd enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, visit the archive to check out previous episodes, and while you're at it, leave us a review.
That wraps it up for this episode, wall crawlers. We hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks for the season finale. Until then, we'll leave you with an oldie from the Neon Hearts. This is Regulations.
Good morning and good night.